right, we are talking about arrays today. So if we remember back to our previous unit, in one of our classes, we talked about making a trivia class where we had 5 different questions, where each one was represented by its own string variable. Each question had a corresponding answer variable, which we used to ask a trivia question and check if the user's response was correct. Now, this works fine if I have 5 questions, but what would happen if I wanted to add more questions? If I wanted to make, let's say, 100 different questions, I would need an individual variable for every single one, which is really just not gonna do well. So, because we need 100 different variables for our questions, we need 100 different variables for our answers, which is just a huge amount of additional work. So what we can do instead of this is there is a type of variable in Java that is able to store a whole bunch of the same type of values. And it's called the array. Arrays are essentially just a list of elements. They are a list of a bunch of values that all have to be the same type. And we can make arrays using whatever data type we choose, whether it's a primitive type or a reference type. You can essentially make an array of whichever kind. So arrays are going to store a fixed number of elements of the same type in one variable. So let's say I have my variable int and then these square brackets scores. So they're storing a fixed number of elements, which means we are not allowed to change the size of our array once it's been created. So once I make this array having these 5 elements, I cannot change the size of my array. I cannot add more elements or subtract elements. I'm always going to have exactly 5. I can change the values at each of these positions, but I cannot add more or subtract from the number of positions. And also, we are storing a fixed number of elements of the same type. So we're not allowed to mix and match types within our arrays. Every single value within a single array has to be the exact same type, which we're going to identify when we create that array. So here we see that int and then those square brackets scores, saying all of the values in this array are going to be integers. Now, this is different from some other programming languages. Python, for example, enables you to both change the size and have a variety of different types within a single list within an array. In Java, you cannot mix and match types, and you cannot resize once they've been created. So the values that you're storing inside of an array, each individual one is referred to as an element. So I have 5 elements in this array of integers. Every element within an array has an index, which is essentially its address. We talked about indices back when we discussed strings, where we have every single index here is referring to one of these elements. So we're going to start at 0 and go up by 1 each time. So each element has its own unique address. If we want to create an array in our program that is filled with the default value for that type, we can use this format. So we're going to use whatever type we want with those square brackets, the name of our array. We're going to have our new type, second set of square brackets with the number of elements we want. So like I said before, we need to indicate the type of value our array is going to hold. And then we're showing this is an array by having that empty set of square brackets, saying this is an array of this type of elements. Clearly, we're going to have a name any variable needs to have a name. And on the right side of our equal sign, we're going to use our new keyword because arrays are actually objects. And we also, once again, need to say what type of array we're creating with and use that set of square brackets. And we need to include how many elements we want this array to have. So I would need an integer value of how many elements are going to be in this array once I create it. So as an example, if I wanted to make an array of 5 int values, it would look like this. I have my type, my square brackets. Let's say my variable is named scores. It equals a new int with those square brackets and the number 5 inside. So I'm going to have 5 values in my array, and all of them are going to start at 0. That is the default value for integers. So if we look at our different types, our default values are going to vary between different ones. But default is essentially just going to equal 0 or nothing. So with my 2 numeric types, my default value is going to be either 0 or 0.0 with a double. If I have a Boolean, the nothing value is false. With a char, it is just going to be an empty set of quotes. Empty single quotes, there is no character here, it's not a space. And for literally any type of object, the default value is going to be null, saying there's no object data here. And that is going to include strings. So if you have an array of strings that you create using this method, using the default values, it's going to be an array full of null strings. You'll have to initialize them later. Does what I've discussed so far make sense? Any queries on that? Cool. All right. If we want to create an array that will start with non-default values in it, we need to use a slightly different format. So we're still going to have our declaration on the left. That's going to be the same. We have our type and then square brackets and the name of our array. And then on the right side of these square brackets, or the equal sign, sorry, we're going to have a set of curly braces with the list of our initial values in it. So let's say I wanted to initialize my scores array to have those 5 integer values. We've still got our int square brackets and then our name of our array. And then we have our 5 different values separated by commas inside of our curly braces here. So this is going to create an array with 5 elements, but instead of them all starting at 0, they're each going to start at the value we have specified here. And like I said at the beginning, we can have arrays using whatever data type we want. There's not restricted to just ints. So I could have a string, an array of string elements. So if I wanted 10 null strings, I would have string array named str equals new string array with 10 elements. So that's going to have 10 boxes to fill. All of them are going to have null in them from the get-go. If I want to make an array of doubles, I would just say I want a double typed array called nums equaling a new double array full with 100 values. It's going to be 100 0.0s in each of the boxes. So each box has 1 0. There are 100 boxes in this array. And I can do the initialization with other types as well. I can make an array of strings. So once again, a string array with named greetings. And I have 5, or this is not 5, this is 4 elements of different greetings, different strings for a greeting in a different language. So each of those is going to populate one of my 4 elements in this array so that it now exists just like that. And we actually can make arrays of whatever type we want. So even if I have a student class that I have implemented, I can make an array of students, and I can initialize it using those objects, those student objects that I have created. So I would have a student Julian, student Larissa, etc. Each of these would be an object of the student class, and we can have an array of those objects. So does that make sense so far? All right. Once we have created our array, once we have this collection of values, we are able to access individual elements by asking that array for the element at a specific index. So this is a bit easier than grabbing single characters out of a string, because with the string we had to use the substring method. With an array, it's much, much simpler. All we need to do is say the name of the array, and then with those square brackets, we need to say what index we want to access. So if my array is scores, it has the values 80, 92, 87, 99, 83, and I'm trying to access at index 2. There's our list of indices starting at 0. Counting in most things in Java is going to start at 0, as well as most other programming languages. Counting will start at 0 instead of 1. So indices start at 0, so our element number 2 is 87. So when we print a score, we will get 87. And very similarly, we are allowed to update elements within an array using the index as well. So we're going to once again reference our array, and then we need to say at which index we would like to make change. So scores, and then those square brackets are simply saying at index 2. So scores at index 2 equals 95. So once again, 0, 1, 2, this element in the array is no longer going to be 87. It will then be 95. So if I print scores at index 2, I will get 95. So once, like I said before, arrays, their indices will start at 0 instead of at 1. Also, similarly to strings, we are able to find the length of an array, the number of elements, using its length attribute. However, unlike strings, this is just it's an instance variable for any array object. It is not going to be or you're not going to call a method to access this value. So if I have my scores array that we've been declaring, I can print scores.length. This is just a variable within my scores array. Within any array, you have access to that length, and that will tell you how many elements there are. So our length here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. So we will print the number 5. Keep in mind that the last index within our array is always going to be the length of the array minus 1. Because since we start at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is our index for our final element. If we ever try to access our arrays at an index that there is not an element, if we are going over the edge, we're going to encounter an array index out of bounds exception. Clearly, we do not want to run into one of these. This will crash our program. So if my scores array is the same as it has been, 80, 92, 87, 99, 83, I have 5 elements. So if I try to access at index number 5, recall that the largest index here is 4, we're going to get that error saying, hey, you can't access that index. It does not exist within that array. So just when you are working with arrays, be careful that you're not trying to access elements that don't exist. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning, arrays are objects. So they have methods and they have attributes built into them. So for instance, the length attribute, the length variable, belongs to every single array that you create. So every one is going to have access to that length variable. In addition to that, if we pass an array to a method, any changes that take place within that method will be reflected in the array after you have run that method. So if I have a method called change, which takes an array of integers called nums and adds 5 to element 0 within that array, within my main, I'm going to make my array of integers called numbers. That's going to equal 5, 10, 15. If I print out numbers at index 0 beforehand, I'm going to see the number 5 because that is currently the value at that index. If I call change on numbers, numbers is going to go up here. It's going to initialize this variable nums. But since it's an object, any changes that happen to nums will happen to numbers as well. So when I add 5 to element 0 within nums, element 0 within numbers is also going to have 5 added to it because they're pointing toward that same exact object data. So when I print my after with number 0, I'm going to see 10. My number has changed because of what happened in this method. So just keep that in mind while you're working with arrays. They are passed by reference, just like any other object we've been working with. So, brief recap of what we've talked about today. Arrays are a type of object that can store multiple values of the same type. When we create an array, we need to state what kind of values are going to be held in that array and how many values are going to be held in that array. So type and quantity. Once we have created an array, we are not allowed to change either of those values. We cannot change what type it holds, nor can we change how many values it will hold. That is set in stone once the array has been created. If we want to make a different array, we need to make a different array. We cannot change the ones that we've already created. Now, you are able to use a variable to choose how long an array should be. So if you create, if you have a user input asking for a number, you can use that variable to create the size of an array. So it could be different each time your program runs, but it is not going to, you can't change it after it has been created within the time you're running this program. All right, any questions on this introduction to arrays? All cool?